Let's talk about this corporate residential government debt scenario. So in other words, the people in Greece are being asked now to suffer austerity measures, whereas the banks and the governments are being bailed out. Again, this asymmetry. The banks are part of this European 960 billion European-wide bailout. So this is then an example of this. Am I right?
Yeah, to a large extent, a lot of that money that's being borrowed to supposedly support Greece is then going to make sure that Greece can actually pay its bankers. And again, if the bankers are lent responsibly to Greece, that set up part of the problem. That's not to say that Greece doesn't have a rather overly generous welfare system and rather too many easy runs for its people compared to countries like Germany. So the Germans do have some genuine complaint to make when I think, for example, in the Greece, the age of retirement in Greece is 3 years younger than Germany, so far as I understand. And the retirement terms for Greek public servants are much more generous compared to the size of the economy than the German ones are. So there are some genuine reasons to complain about the level of spending in Greece, and there is some reason to say you've been living on the hog to some extent. But the reality is that the level of debt that's been accumulated, a large part of it we know can sharp back to the banking sector. They're a large part of the beneficiaries from the bailout as well. And when you have a downturn driven by private sector deleveraging, the last thing you want is to have the government sector doing the same thing on top of that. And that's what these austerity programs will force on them. We tend to forget, unfortunately, the large part of the reason why a certain Hitler rose to power back in the 1930s was American banks refused to roll over loans to German banks and caused austerity to be forced on the German population and gave rise to extremist views at the time. And, we're playing the same songbook, and I don't understand why people don't realize the dangers of that.
Right. The time to look at the spread between, let's say, Southern Europe and Northern Europe in terms of pension, entitlement programs would be during a credit expansion, not during a credit contraction. Let me ask you this about this idea where the reforms are coming at the bottom or the beginning of a credit crunch or during a credit crunch. It almost seems as though the so-called bond vigilantes or speculators are going beyond just imposing fiscal authority. They seem to be actually attacking, using their positions in the markets, not only to bring about some kind of orderly spread between the entitlement programs intra-Europe, but to actually benefit from the chaos and to make the situation worse. Do you see that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you look at the level of deficit that Greece has, it's, the amount of money they need compared to what is needed by the much larger economies of Italy and Spain, it's trivial. So what you've had is an attempt by the European governments to bring in a shock and awe change where they bring in $1 billion, which sounds like a trillion, which sounds like a huge amount of money, to fight off the contagion effect. But of course, that could be exhausted in 1 year by the level of deficits these countries are running, since they're forced to live within the Maastricht Treaty. That's going to be under that, the margin above that is where the $1 trillion is going to go. And if I was a bond vigilante or a currency vigilante, I'd be saying, right, that'll fund will run out in about maybe 15 months. I'll be ready for another bailout being necessary. Then there'll be a plunge in the euro, and I'm going to hedge forward to make money out of the plunge. So I'm sure they're sitting there thinking the euro is doomed, either in terms of a breakup of the worst extreme, or more likely a rapid devaluation when the rules of the Maastricht Treaty are completely breached, and they're going to make money out of it. They'll make money out of chaos.
Well, yeah, what's amazing is that the fact is that even a $1 trillion increase in the supply of fiat money that's being generated as a result of this bailout, no matter how fast the printing presses of the ECB and the Federal Reserve run to create more fiat money, the ability for folks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan to sell naked bonds, which is effectively their own printing press, they're counterfeiting bonds out there. They have a lot more, it's a lot easier for them to counterfeit bonds and to introduce a naked short selling of bonds at a much faster clip than even the central banks can issue fiat currency.
Well, that's the trouble. I mean, central banks, even though they can issue as much fiat as they like, do two things wrong. One is they can't lever it, whereas the private sector can. And that leverage gives them the power to turn, a smaller amount of money into far greater level of leveraged buying power on the currency markets. But the governments are also making the mistake of thinking they have to sterilize this money by selling bonds back to the public. And what you've got is a transfer, therefore, from private sector debt to public sector debt. Now, the real problem that we've got into, one of the many problems we've got into, is we've let credit money expand far too rapidly, and it's overbalanced the amount of fiat money in the system. You take a look at the level of M0 in America versus M1 and M2 and the M3, they don't even bother recording anymore. There's been a plunge in the ratio of fiat money to credit money. And only one way out of this, one thing we have to do is ultimately rebalance that and have more fiat money, which means you've got to basically, in the old-fashioned sense of the word, print the stuff. You don't try to sterilize it. You simply have to reduce the overhang of credit money in the system. So the fact they're trying to stop doing that actually means they're actually undoing part of the good that they're trying to cause.
Right. So up until recently, the European Central Bank and Trichet was trying to convince the world that they were not going to give in to things like quantitative easing and excessive money printing and hostage. Essentially, they've been taken hostage by the investment banking world, and that now they're doing going along for the ride in terms of printing lots of money, which is only exacerbating the problem because, as you are referring to it, it's not money in terms of it being valued at anything with an intrinsic value. You keep referring to it as credit money. So all they're doing is increasing the debt, and of course that means the debt interest. And in the U.S., for example, I noticed that now they're at that magical debt service to interest of 90% of GDP, which historically usually means death spiral. Is that a fair statement?
Well, it's certainly when a sovereign government like America that has a captive Federal Reserve and has most of the debt that it owes and denominate its own currency can basically cover whatever level of debt it creates as an accounting entry. It's countries that can't do that that end up going into default, like the Argentina of the world and now also the pigs, because though they have their own treasuries, they don't have their own central bank. So that's why the crisis, that's when about 6 months ago, people asked me where the next crisis will be, and I said it's going to be in Europe, because they won't be able to finance their deficits, which they're going to be forced into by the collapse of private sector spending, where in America the government can always finance its government deficits because the Federal Reserve is a captive underwriter of any debt the American government runs up. So that's the real cause of this sovereign debt crisis. And ultimately, the only way out of it is to abolish the Maastricht Treaty's 3% rule, because that was a rule developed by neoclassical economists, so people who have no idea of how the economy operates, who thought that a global financial crisis was a total impossibility, and of course that government action couldn't do anything to make anything better. They designed that 3% limit. And now, of course, we've moved on a mere 10 years, and reality has caught up with neoclassical theory, but we haven't yet changed the Maastricht Treaty to make it possible for those governments to have their deficits funded. That's the real dilemma for the use of the sovereign debt problem. And so, but of course, once that's addressed, we have the other side of the problem. When suddenly you go from having European deficits supposedly limited to 3%, therefore making the euro appear to be a strong currency, when it becomes a 10% deficit, the euro will become a weak currency, and down it'll go on currency markets, and that'll cause all sorts of chaos in the rest of the world too. America will find it rather harder to export to Europe when that happens.